So right now we are going to have a discussion with all the panelists. We'll have some questions coming in, and I just want to say thank you to all of the panelists for sharing your thoughts and your experiences and your brilliance this afternoon. I think we are off to a very important and depthful start to this ongoing conversation around this very complex issue. And one of the themes that came up a few times, and Stanley, you certainly touched upon it, was this idea of leadership, right? And what needs to happen in terms of change and systemic change, and how systems are changed. And I want to read an interesting quote about our concept of leadership here in Western culture from Dr. Helena Liu. She says in her book, Redeeming Leadership, leadership holds a mythic status in our culture. Few of us can agree on what leadership is, yet many believe that it's inherently good and urgently needed. Irrespective of the organizational predicament or societal crises, leadership is often prescribed as the panacea that will solve all ills. Our romance with leadership has kept the business of leadership, theorizing, development, and consultancy profitable while maintaining systems of power. So what I really want to ask you, because we're talking about systems, and particularly in Albany and political systems are incredibly hierarchical, right? So can we create or reimagine systems and power and hierarchy through a different lens where it is inclusive and socially just? And I'm going to throw that out. I'm going to take myself off the camera, and any one of you can jump in to respond to that question.
I'll go. And I do want to use Catalina as an example for this, because I think one way to do that is to ensure that the people who are in a position of power are the people who have lived experiences, and to recognize that the people who are in a position of power would not be where they are without the people who they surround themselves with. And sometimes that can be a good thing, and sometimes that can be a bad thing. And what we need to do is lift people up like Catalina, who was a staffer. I'm telling you, no elected official would be where they are without their staff. And unfortunately, staff are treated like crap by the system. They are underpaid, they are overworked, they have less protections if they are public employees than private employees. And so we need to strengthen the protections and lift up the people who are around those in power. And when you have elected officials who have been there before, who have been the staffers, who have committed themselves to public service, regardless of the harassment and discrimination that they had to face, regardless of the low pay and the long hours, they get it. They know what the staffers are going through. And so they are more mindful about that and more willing to step up and, again, show that institutional courage and protect their staffers as much as they can in this toxic culture that we have. And so I think one way to change that and make it more socially just is to make sure that we are protecting those at the quote unquote bottom and recognizing that they actually have to be the ones that are at the top. That when it's the elected officials who are standing on the floor at 3 o'clock in the morning and giving their speeches, there's a staffer behind them that has been up for 48 hours negotiating that budget and is running papers after papers to the floor so that the elected officials can read the budget. We need to empower those staffers. We need to protect those staffers because they will do even more to lift up people like Catalina who are in office, and that's what we need.
Thank you, Erica. Stanley is requesting to go next. Is that okay with everyone?
I saw Catalina unmuted, so she can go first. I can wait.
Thank you, Stanley. I totally agree with what Erica is saying, and I want to add a couple of things. First, an anecdote. You said that about running papers back and forth. That actually happened to me during the last day of session. Something didn't print out correctly, and Robin at 3 in the morning had to run to our office on the other end and bring it back. And I say that because, look, I think I think we'd all like to be optimistic and assume that because an elected has been a staffer, that they'd be much more understanding. But there is a seductive part on power. Sometimes many of my colleagues, and I'll say many because fortunately it's many, whether it's at federal level, state level, when you've never had power and all of a sudden you have a little bit of it, there aren't people checking you. There aren't people reminding you that at the end of the day, you still got to do your laundry. You're still a very normal person. You still got to clean your house. They forget that piece. And I have seen many elected officials who used to be staffers have an extremely high turnover. And I have heard horror stories of how they treat their staff. To me, actually, an effective elected official isn't just the one that surrounds himself with smart people, but who's kind to their staff. And look, we all have bad days. There are days when I'm hangry and when I'm tired and I can be a not very nice person, but I will be damned if I don't fight for my team. And I feel disgusted when I see, when I hear the stories of how some of the folks around me will treat their teams. And so I think it starts with electing people, not just that have been former staffers and understand that piece of it, but who aren't in this for themselves, who aren't in this for the glory of being on TV, who are in this because they understand that if they're not there at 3 o'clock in the morning trying to pass that budget with the right team surrounding them, that the kind of community they represent will go without services, will go without the basic things that they need. And so it's all connected. And in this leadership piece, I think when we think about it, we also have to think about that piece of the seduction of power. And what it means when you have the kind of leadership that is more worried about keeping the power than sharing the power.
Thank you, Assembly Member. Latifa.
Thank you. Absolutely second to all the panelists' comments and responses to this question. You know, culturally, the root of what we're talking about are these systemic imbalances and these systemic structures that are built on and in service to oppression. And so looking at the workplace or looking at the political sphere, it's not exclusive. So it's not like it only applies in some cases. It absolutely applies in this case at all, and as well. And we even know now that, you know, polling after the last election shows that people are getting this. You know, even Republicans compared to 2016 appreciate that it would be beneficial for more women to be in power than not, perceiving the power imbalances differently than they did 4 years ago, and suggesting that, you know, they're shifting, their thinking is shifting. Ultimately, you know, it's not, we see this across the board, whether at the state level or across nations, and that it really does matter who's at the table, and it really does matter who is making the decisions, creating or disrupting the culture as it is, to start to shift these imbalances that are ingrained and in some ways very structurally sound. So, you know, how we imagine a different paradigm at the same time trying to affect the structure that we don't have a choice in working in is really the challenge I think we're faced with today. What is it that we actually just need to dismantle? And while we're trying to figure out a revision, you know, what does this look like? What can we be doing to be continually disrupting and continually shifting the power imbalance in the structures that exist? And there are study after study that show when we have change in power, where, I mean, frankly, women are in power, you know, employees benefit, the policies, the supports, the culture shifts, because fundamentally, women at these high levels of power and holding these positions is not part of the design. And so, you know, it is not fodder to say that, you know, we need more women and we need more people of color. It is truly in a major intervention that is really critical to how we shift.
I wanna jump in
Thank you.
real quick.
Oh, I'm sorry, Stan. I just want to make one announcement because we're getting several questions from our participants or our attendees, and we will take questions from the audience at approximately 2:10. So we're just going to continue to have this panel discussion as well, but I just wanted to let our attendees know what was happening. Go.
Thank you. So to kind of go back to that first question of like whether you can have like hierarchies and like it be healthy spaces. I just want to just say, like, let's first talk about leadership and what leadership is. Leadership is service more than anything else. If you're in a leadership position, that means you have skill sets, you have done things that have shown that you can get things done. And now you're not just someone who's quote unquote in charge, but you're a coach. You're a coach, you're a mentor, you're a supporter. That's the biggest piece. And you're helping people be accountable, but the goal is to get from point A to point B. And I think if we have a more sober understanding and like belief of what leadership is, I think we'll be in a lot better space, because there is power in leadership. There absolutely is. But with that power comes a lot of responsibility, and at least in my opinion, accountability. You know, I got a nice fancy title now. I'm like New York State political director. It's real cool, looks great on my business card, and like my friends think it's fancy, right? That's great. But that also puts me in charge of a staff of about 25 to 30 people now. Those people are going to rely on me to make sure they can get their jobs done. They're going to rely on me to make sure they can troubleshoot through issues. They're going to expect me to hold them accountable. They're going to expect me and rely on me to make sure it is a healthy space to work in. That's not power. I'm honored that these people trust me to lead them and support them in that work. And because that's the way I'm framing it, like my approach is completely different. I'm trying to do things in collaboration. I'm trying to make sure that like we're working together. I will hold people accountable when necessary, but like even that right there is through an escalating process so that like we're making sure it's done in a healthy way. So that's the first thing that's really important. The second thing that's really important is it does not matter how good you are, particularly as a male. You have blind spots and you may show up poorly sometimes. And there needs to be a real ability to be held accountable, even if it doesn't feel good. The fact of the matter is people are not gold diggers. No one wants to put their career at risk, their livelihood and their reputation at risk with an accusation when they could just keep on going about their lives and their business and doing what they have to do. If they're speaking up, it is a problem. And the fact of the matter is, I want to take a bit of a pivot and talk about assault for a second. Trigger warning, but like they say 1 out of 4 women are have been assaulted or will be assaulted. That number is underreported because most people do not report it because they get ostracized, criticized. Some people get criminalized for it. And in Albany, in a place where there's so much power and people are running their offices with not much accountability, it is very easy that if someone rubs you the wrong way, you can very quickly deal with them in a way that resolves a problem for you as a person in power and messes up their life. So people are not speaking up because it's fun or because they want money. So as we're like stepping into these leadership spaces, we got to make sure that like, 1, it's about service. 2, it's about creating safe spaces with accountability, clear systems and clear processes. And 3, not forgetting what you're there for, because we have plenty of healthy examples of hierarchies. You can look at sports teams where you have a team captain, you have a coach, you have a general manager, but the team plays together because we're all fighting for the same goal. So why do the New York Knicks get it, but we can't figure that out in Albany? Sorry for the sports reference. I can't help it.
It's an interesting analogy. I'm not 100% with you. You know, teams are teams until somebody decides to make a political statement, but that's another conversation for another day. But this idea of hierarchy and reaching a critical mass of women, to what Latifa was talking about, does the landscape change when more women get into positions of power? Because systems are so saliently kept in place, right? And we know, we've heard this story before, running for office is very different than serving in office, right? Assemblymember Cruz, you could speak to that. So what happens when you get into the system, and to Latifa's point, if you want to change it, we have to really literally gut it. You know, I think of like renovating a house, but you still have to function. So how do we create an environment where we're really transforming a structure, really like gutting it, because we have to gut patriarchy and systems of privilege. because power is intoxicating in our culture, because we're raised to believe that it is. So how do we do that while simultaneously building a critical mass of women at the table and hoping that will change the landscape, and then creating a blueprint or a roadmap to move forward?
Look, I think there's several pieces that go into this. I'll go back to what I was saying before of running for office for the right reasons. You know, when you run for office because it's the next best thing in your career, because you have nothing else to do with $8 million, because, I mean, not throwing shade at anyone, or simply because you think that you are God's gift to your community, because there are many people who walk around our districts like that. The problem with running for those reasons is that once you can tell the world whatever you think they need to hear in order to elect you, and then you'll get into office and you will compromise every single one of your alleged beliefs because they weren't your beliefs in the first place. So when you have people who have been close to the pain because they've themselves or someone they love have experienced it, they've done the work, they've really run for the right reasons, you're going to get the kind, hopefully, of elected official who isn't wavering in their own ethics, in being able to say, I'm going to make this decision because even if I have to compromise a little bit, I'm going to be able to sleep at night, and I'm doing it for the improvement and the betterment of my community, not so that I can keep that power that I now could be addicted to. Now, I've had plenty of opportunities to side with the idea of keeping power. And when I got elected, I knew, you know, I have a career as a lawyer, that if this didn't work out, I'd be more than happy to step out and let somebody else lead, because it wasn't about me, it was about what my community needed. And when you think of it that way, when you think of that power structure that way, it's a much easier decision to go in and dismantle. But it's also something you have to recognize that when you're new, I'm no longer a new member, but when you're new, you don't have that much power to change things. You gotta start building bridges. Build bridges to the folks who, even those who may not agree with you always, because you may need them for something. And you build those kinds of relationships with advocates. Now, I know Stanley since I ran, you know, and we've been running in these streets for a number of other reasons. And you build that kind of relationship that says, I see you, you see me, and you know that we're fighting for the same thing. And so when that bad signal goes out on an issue, whether it's 58 that we were all fighting for, whether it's other types of criminal justice reform, whether it's the sexual harassment working group, when that bad signal goes out to our allies, everybody shows up. And everybody shows up to fight. And that's that other kind of leadership where you know you can count on certain folks who show up for you. And so I say this because that's the kind of thing that those elected officials who don't understand that this isn't about them, that this seat, this job doesn't belong to them, it belongs to the people, are going to be more than willing and happy to compromise their alleged beliefs in order to keep that power. And I think of the relationships, and I think of the people that it is affecting. And that's how we end up with the kind of culture in Albany that has allowed sexual harassment to go on for so long. Because when you run, you'll say whatever it is. And when you got there, if you saw it happening right in front of your eyes, you'll look the other way and you'll just keep on going about your daily life. But that's not what we're going to do anymore. That is not what we're going to do. I will tell a brief story without saying names or too much detail. About 2-3 years ago, we were at one of the various parties that happen in Albany, political gatherings that happen in Albany. And a staffer for someone touched inappropriately a staffer for somebody else. And both Robin and I were there, and all hell broke loose because that was not about to happen in front of us. And we respected this staffer's choice and willingness to come forward and do whatever it was that this staffer wanted to do, because it was about protecting the staffer. But if you have someone looking at this happening and you stay quiet and you do nothing, and you're an elected official, as Stanley was saying, you're trash. You're absolute trash, and you don't deserve your seat. And so don't compromise. And if you do compromise a little too much, we vote you out.
Yeah, Assembly member, that's so true. And I do want to say one thing. There was an amazing article in The Nation by Alexis Grinnell called "Mediocre Men Have Failed New York," and she references a paper, a study that was done in 2005 by two psychology professors that showed that when a system is in a dire place, whether it be a private company or public institution like government, women are tended to be put in the position of power to bring us out, right? So when we are, it's called the glass cliff. So when this institution is at its worst and needs to be lifted up and repaired, it is women who assume those roles of power. And yes, I think, Stanley talked about this in his introduction about how there's a type of feminine approach to using power and to governing, if you will. And that does inherently bring more compassion and kindness and care to the position. But we need to be clear here and recognize that being a woman or identifying yourself as a woman does not inherently make you better as a leader. And it does not make you better in holding power, because I know firsthand that there are women in power who are worse than men in power when it comes to standing with survivors. And I think it is very important to recognize that regardless of your gender or your gender identity, you can still be a power abuser and you can still protect power abusers. And so that's why it's important for everybody, right? Not just the women. And yes, it is more likely for women to stand up for other women, but we also need to be able to be willing to hold other women accountable when they do not have the willingness or courage to show that institutional courage. Catalina and her chief of staff, Robin, showed that at that party, right? But I bet you there were elected officials, other women in that room who saw the same thing go down and turn their heads. And so we cannot be picking and choosing who we choose to hold accountable, and we cannot pick and choose who we allow to compromise to a certain level. Women in powerful positions do not deserve the right to compromise more just because they are women. Everybody needs to be held accountable for the compromises that they choose to make.
Thank you, Erica. It's 2:13, so I want to transition to some of the questions that have been coming in to all of you. And since we're talking about politics and Albany, I think it's fitting that we start with this question. What is the role of the voter when it comes to holding elected officials accountable? Let's start with Assemblymember Cruz on that one.
I think the first thing is showing up and actually voting. It's, and I say this as the elected who represents a district with the lowest voting turnout in the entire state of New York. And so, we want to act like we are the kind of society where voting is something that happens all the time. But we saw last night, for those of us in New York City, how difficult it was to get people to show up at the polls. Erica was working a campaign that I was supporting, and it is tough. And so I think that's the first thing. I think the other thing is really question in depth. Elected officials, of people running, love to give you one-liners when they come and they meet you, or when they knock on your door, or when you see them on TV. They love to give you that top line and say that they're going to do X, Y, and Z without really getting into depth about how they're going to do it. And I'm not just talking about that infinite question of how you're going to pay for it, because it isn't just about how you're going to pay for it. That's part of how are you going to deliver for us as a community. But if they tell you, I'll use an example. If they tell you that they support immigrants, how do you support immigrants? What have you done, or what do you plan to do, and how do you plan to deliver it? Well, I want to combat sexual harassment in the workplace. How? Do you know that the laws that are out there? Do you know what we need to be doing? I think if we allow folks running for office to get away too often with knowing absolutely nothing about what they're talking about. And it is very sad Because we have folks who may be very well intentioned, but they will get up on a microphone and say things like, New York City needs domestic violence shelters. Come on, guys. We may not have the best ones, but we have them. And we're okay with that type of mediocre person running for office. So we ourselves as voters need to do better. And we also need to do better by not voting for those folks just because, they have a funny meme or a catchy line, or they happen to have the greatest commercial. No, vote for the kind of person who really gives you a plan of action, who isn't going negative on their opponents simply because they feel like they're losing. So that is, I think, the main thing that the voter can do. And importantly, when they get elected, hold them to task. Hold them to task, because folks who run for office love making promises and breaking them. When I ran, I would often tell my voters, I am one of 150 members. I will fight like hell for the issues that I believe in, but I cannot promise you that I will make them happen, because it isn't just up to me. And until we as electeds talk more honestly to people, they're going to continue to mistrust politicians. And so you ask in depth and you hold them accountable. If they said that they were going to fight gentrification, for example, and then during the campaign or the re-election, an article comes out that they were actually taking money from developers, how hard do you think they're going to fight? So hold people accountable. The words that come out of their mouth need to be matched by their actions. And if they're not, support someone else to run against them.
I want to add to that, those really important messages by saying, you can also sometimes tell. I mean, campaigns can be small, or they can be large. They can be $8 million or more. And there's a couple of things I think we should be asking candidates when they're candidates, because there is already information we know about how this person leadership has carried out in their lives. It is not enough for people to come forward and say, here's what I will do when and if. You need to ask them, what have they done and what are they doing? They are employers if they have campaign staff. And some of these questions about what are the principles that you hold as an employer of your staff now and before, so I think those two things are really critical. How aware they are of the policies in their current or previous job, if they're moving jobs, how aware are they of how their staff are treated, and what the culture is like. You could say, what's the culture like on your campaign? When you were working at your law firm, did your company support caregiving, and was there a policy against sexual harassment? And if not, what did you think about that? I mean, these folks have decades of experience in the workplace that they're coming into. It is not a blank slate. And I think with the news cycle, with social media, also, by the way, with public funding, there are opportunities that we have now to put people on notice by asking these critical questions that are not limited to a debate platform, that can really show, what the person and their leadership style is all about. And I think while, you may have a campaign platform on the issues, it doesn't necessarily speak to you and your values as a leader. And so much of that leadership pervades what happens in the culture of your organization or organizations. So I think asking people about the culture of work, what kind of leader are they? What kind of culture do they want to see in the workplace when they become elected? And what are they doing for their campaign workers now? And it would be interesting to see, what answers you get. There are people who have decided to get ahead of that and establish policies. They exist, they're out there. They're recommendations that any politician can find to say, like, how do I run ethically, a safe, ethical, and equitable campaign? What does that look like? And I think we have an opportunity looking into the next cycles to sort of try to uphold some of those standards. And, I think people want you to not think about their past. They want to talk about what they're going to do. But, you know, people, like they say, like, you know, people are who they are, and they show you who they are. And I think it's easy to, you know, kind of brush things under the rug during a campaign, but ask those critical questions about culture.
Thank you, Latifa. Just a time check, we're at 2:20. So I want to throw out another question to the panel. This is a big one. What models or examples are out there in the workplace that have successfully challenged or changed the system of power structures? And what were the factors in their success?
Well, I can start. Power structures, there's lots of different ways that you can think about that, but I would certainly say that the dynamics of organizing and the dynamics of folks' ability to organize as workers, whether they're formally unionized or not, is a major factor in how employees have the ability and the agency to show up. And so you know, there are worker centers, there's a lot of new models of organizing. You know, there's a lot of new models of organizing that are happening when in dominated industries like caregiving and domestic workers or women. And when those organizing efforts take place, the dynamic changes. And so together there's more power. And there's an assumption, as we know, both, you know, there's an assumption and also an effort to keep organizing as dissipated as possible. But there are, you know, I think that sense of agency and power and bargaining is really critical. And that's one example, which we know is not what it used to look like, and for sure, and not often where there are women dominated occupations.
Yeah, I definitely agree, Latifa. I think we sort of saw this on the city council level. You know, organizing and unionization efforts had started before former council member King was brought up on ethics charges, but when he was not expelled the first time, that certainly propelled the conversation a little quicker and more publicly as well. Seeing staffers really stepping out into the public and organizing in such a public way. You know, state legislative staffers cannot organize in that way. They cannot unionize. So that's definitely something, you know, that we see and I believe will be successful for city council staffers. And I would love to see happen on the state level as well. And another thing, and, you know, I don't know if we can call this a success yet, but I do think it can happen. You know, the Connecticut state legislature did anonymous climate surveys. And again, this is something that Dr. Jennifer Freyd talks about a lot is climate surveys, where people, staffers, people in a workspace can really talk openly and freely about how they're feeling and the type of work environment that's being created for them. And you know, you cannot solve a problem if you don't know what it is in the first place. You need those facts, you need those, the data and the details, and anonymous climate surveys can really do that. And look, this kind of goes back again to what Stanley said in his intro, that means having hard conversations, right? Getting the hard, difficult information that can be really uncomfortable for people in a position of power to look at, especially those who might think that maybe they're not creating a perfect work environment, but it's okay. Things are all right. Staff turnover is okay. It's not huge, it's not high, but so we're doing what we can. But if you know, climate surveys allow the people on the ground who are doing the work to be able to voice how they're truly feeling, and then provide them the opportunity to be a part of the solution. And so, you know, I know the Connecticut state legislature has really started to look into those. And I think that, you know, anonymous surveys, climate surveys would be incredibly helpful and can be a really good model to be implemented.
And Erica, if I may add something on the climate surveys, you know, and sometimes a little bit of more of an official hand is needed. I have a bill that basically would force employers over a certain amount that have a certain amount of employees to actually report on those same kind of information and into the Division of Human Rights, because how do we figure out how to resolve a problem if we don't have enough data on it? And so salary ranges, when someone started, other demographics, if they get a promotion, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so combining that with something like what you're saying, it's how we get the data to kind of get to the root of the problem.
I just one quick addition is like just a very simple like staffer bill of rights as a first step. You know, I travel to Albany a lot for work. When I do, they take care of my room and board. They take care of food because the assumption is like if you're going to be traveling this much to do this work, we want to make sure that you have the basic necessities covered. There are staffers who have to travel to Albany. They don't even get it per diem. They're just traveling to Albany off of like the passion for the work and vibes. Meanwhile, the elected official has per diem. They're good to go. We know they got the salary. They just got salary increases, and that staffer might be making $60,000 a year, living in New York City, where a one-bedroom apartment costs $10,000 a month plus half of your soul. So there's some very simple things we can do right now to make things slightly easier for folks. And then also, COVID has taught us very clearly the toll, the amount of work that parents have to put in. And no disrespect to my dads out there, but the amount of work that moms have to put in. Because until you've had to have a planning meeting with somebody who has 3 kids who are virtual learning on one laptop with shaky Wi-Fi, like you don't understand how hard it can be to be a mother in real time. And like, what are we doing to make sure that like we're not just like paying people equitably, but also being like, hey, you're doing a lot. How about a couple of days off on the house or a bonus or just something? Because it's just, you know, I've seen lots of mothers live heaven and earth, and now we're all expected to go back into the world like they didn't just have to do that.
Thank you, Stanley. And we are transitioning now. It's 2:27, but I want to thank all of our panelists. I'm going to hand it over to our fearless leader, Beverly Neufeld. But I just want to thank you all for your comments and your commitment and your passion. It's been a real pleasure. And I look forward to furthering these conversations. Take it away, Bev.